Good evening, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's 3-minute PhD Society talk. And I'm delighted to welcome renowned author, Mr. Ian McGregor. Those of you who don't know, he's written many books, selling Checkpoint Charlie, which I've had rave reviews of tonight.
Yeah, that's
and
good.
US Civil War, Battle to Battle, and the Lighthouse and Sound his latest book, The Hiroshima Men, is subject for tonight's talk. You can also hear Ian on We Have Ways podcast, Rest is History podcast, and Snow's podcast, and recently a speaker at the Chalk Valley for 700 people. Unfortunately, can't manage 700 tonight.
It's all right.
The other 650 are watching their heads.
You look friendlier.
Also tonight, Ian's selection of books, very well priced. Hiroshima Man is only 25, and I've been to him for 15 tonight, and Starring Brothers go for 10. Ian had lots of cash only. If you've forgotten your cash, you can pay via our transaction and all of us. Anyway, enough of me. I'd like to hand over to Ian, and we look forward to your talk.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Do you want to dim the lights? Just dim the lights a little bit, just so you can... There's a couple of maps I've got in the presentation, and I just wasn't thinking, this has happened in several talks. It's good for me to talk about what I'm going to show you, but there is some annotation on those maps. It's going to be very difficult to see, but I'll do my best to describe it and everything else. So, the Hiroshima Men, it's just been out last month or so. What I do is, I tend to start with this. Could I have a show of hands? Who's seen the movie? Yep, most of us. Okay. So, luckily for me, when the movie came out, I was in Japan. I was there for 2 weeks. I interviewed 14 very elderly Japanese people, men and women, who were obviously children during the war. And it's various perspectives, not just on the atomic bombings, but the fire raids, and just generally what life was like in Japan, because that helped me visualize what I wanted to talk about. But this movie was out, and what I think is a good movie. I think it's a Hollywood version of a very complicated subject, which is what they do well. I think they capture the man probably accurately 80%, because I've done a lot of research on him, and obviously the people around him. There's a couple of things that I think they definitely don't talk about in the movie, and I can understand why. But I will talk about it in the presentation further down, so you'll understand why I think he's a complicated character. But predominantly what I was thinking when I watched the movie was, like I said, tells a really good tale. You can understand why it's won Oscars. The CGI of the Trinity test is very good, but you don't see what the bomb did to Japan. You don't see what it's done to Hiroshima. You don't see what it does to Nagasaki. You don't see any Japanese in the movie, which I think there's slightly an imbalance there, because obviously you need to see what it's done. But anyway, that's just my argument. But anyway, my book is not just about the Second World War. It's not that kind of 4.5-year incredible, insane race to build the bomb before the Nazis and then ultimately got dropped on Japan. It's an essential core of the story, but there's two main big journeys I want to take the reader on. So first of all, it's talking about how a country like Japan would go from embracing everything Western in the 1920s, straight after the Great War, when it was on the Allied side. Didn't get what it wanted at Versailles, obviously. Felt quite put out that what it saw as the white colonialist powers had kind of snubbed it, didn't get many rewards. But how it went from a democracy in the 1920s to mirroring really Nazi Germany. The Depression hits, nationalism really takes hold, which morphs itself into a military dictatorship. Authoritarianism launches a crazy war in China, and then an even crazier war against the Americans and the Allies, like the British, the Dutch, the French, in the Pacific, and pays the price. So that's one of the core stories. The second story, which is just as important, I think, because then you'll understand why I've written the book, is how we go from when the bombs dropped originally. This is the one on Hiroshima. I could have shown you a dozen newspaper headlines from across the world, the Western Allied world, at the time, the day after the bomb. So this is Tuesday, the 7th of August. And every newspaper headline is celebrating this unique super weapon that no one really had an idea the Americans had. It's got an explosive content of between 15 and 20,000 tons of TNT. So it's the biggest explosion in history at that point. Everyone's happy because obviously the war is going to end quicker than everyone thought. There may not be an invasion of mainland Japan. Millions of people don't have to die. The veterans can come home from the Pacific. That's someone's son, husband, uncle, boyfriend, whatever. So the world is celebrating. But within a year, you've got this story in the New Yorker magazine. So at the time, the New Yorker was like the Vogue of its day, high fashion. You would normally read this magazine if you wanted to go on holiday somewhere expensive, wanted to buy a Cadillac, the latest fridge, latest telephone, what movie star's been seen in a cocktail bar in Manhattan. That's the kind of magazine it was. Whereas this edition, which came out almost a year to the day of this, was the one that launched the story of what nuclear fallout does to a human being. Doesn't matter whether it's Japanese or anyone else, it's just what it does to humanity. And that shaped opinion over the next decades as we go into the Cold War, to where, you know, every audience I've talked to, the kind of education we have about the dangers of a nuclear holocaust pretty much stems from this story. Okay, so as I said to a couple of people as I was talking before I did the talk, with the books that I try and do, because obviously the world really doesn't need another book on Hiroshima, I'm really aware of that, unless I can tell a different new story. So what I try and do is try and find people that are either eyewitnesses, and if they weren't eyewitnesses, the second best thing really is people that know them intimately. Because I'm sure a lot of you know the guy on the left, that's Colonel Paul Tibbets Jr., who flew the Enola Gay, who trained the 509th Composite Group to drop the bomb successfully, and then the following plane that dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So an amazing man, obviously died years ago. So the next best thing was I interviewed at length a few of the Tibbets family, one of which was this man here, and that's his grandson, Paul Tibbets IV. And as you can see, he's flying the B-2 stealth bomber. He's retired now, but he flew the first combat mission of the B-2 when it went into operation. I think it was 1998 over Kosovo. But apart from that, weirdly, it's just one of those things, happenstance in history. Both men commanded the same bomber group, the 509th, and then the 317th as well. But what was good is Paul was able to tell me at length about, you know, he was inspired to join the Air Force because of sitting at his grandfather's knee, asking him multiple questions about life in the Air Force, not just obviously flying the Enola Gay, but surviving combat over Europe with the 8th Air Force in a B-17. So he was able to give me a lot of information that I don't think a lot of books have about the character of the man, because that's the key thing I wanted to know is, you know, this is the guy who's dropped the world's first atomic bomb in history. How did he deal with that? And, you know, and how prepared was he to drop it too, which is what I talk about in the book. And then secondly, that magazine I showed you, the New Yorker. So the journalist who would write this story to tell the world about the real kind of dangers, I suppose, of this new nuclear age the world was going into by the late 40s, going into the 50s, was the man on the left here, driving a Jeep, John Hersey. So very successful writer, very talented writer, but he kind of did reinvent what a war reporter should be. So all the guys we see today, well, as far back as Vietnam, the type of guys you see in their flak jackets on the front line with troops in the jungle or in the desert or wherever, right on the front line, taking shots, risking their lives. He kind of invented that because he wanted to join up. He had enlisted in the US Navy, but then he was talked out of it because as soon as they realized, oh, this guy is a very, very talented writer, been published everywhere, they said you could do more good for the war effort if you report on the war. And he said, well, I will, but that's what he wanted to be on the front line. So this photo that I put in is taken from him at the Sicily landings with Patton. But before that, he'd survived 3 weeks of frontline combat on Guadalcanal with the US Marines. First big fight they had with the Japanese. At the time, there was the super Japanese soldier, but it was the first time the Americans got blooded and actually won. It was a long, arduous campaign, a lot of casualties on both sides. He actually almost died in a plane crash when he was going up the island at one point. He actually survived 4 plane crashes during the war. I mean, he should have died, but he didn't. But after Sicily, he then went to the Russian front, and he was with the Red Army as it was pushing through Eastern Europe, ironically Ukraine, Belarus, as they were opening up ghettos, concentration camps, that kind of thing. He did all this before he even got the commission to go and report on Hiroshima. So to talk to him, I interviewed his grandson. There's a lot of grandsons in this presentation, sorry. But this is Canon Hersey. He's a documentary filmmaker, history documentary filmmaker, and he specializes in, it's almost like a bridge building policy he's had over the last 25 years, following in the footsteps of his grandfather, where he goes to Japan, he interviews survivors, but he also interviews American crews who did the bombings and also US Marines, that kind of thing. And then finally, and you probably can't see where you're sitting, but this is, so General Leslie Groves, you can see there. And remember that physique, because I'll explain why he didn't see frontline combat. There he is at the Trinity test with J. Robert Oppenheimer. It's a very famous photo. They're smiling, I think, because I talk about it in the book. They're both alive because at the Trinity test, they underestimated the power of the bomb they were testing. And they realized afterwards there were the whole team that you see in the movie looking excited, putting their goggles on. They realized they'd actually 4 miles too close to the test. But anyway, so here I am with his grandson. This is Richard Groves, ex-US military and very, very successful international businessman. And the reason why, you can't probably see, but we're happy, we've got a big smile because we'd known each other for about 2 years, and then we finally met because he has a serious underlying health issue. And just before COVID, he was on a business trip to Amsterdam, which cost him, basically had to stay in the same hotel for 18 months during lockdown. Couldn't get home because of the seriousness of this condition. So the reason why I was smiling is it was the first time we'd met, even though we talked hours and hours and hours and hours on Zoom and on the phone. Because fantastic for me, he'd said to me, well, I've actually been researching my grandfather's career for the last 20 years. I'm an amateur military historian. Would you like to see my research? I was like, what do you think? So again, incredibly helpful, gave me some really amazing insight into his grandfather. But, the kind of insight about, how do you go about creating an atomic bomb in 3 years? You want to create it quicker than that because you think the Nazis are going to get it first. And you've got to build this cobweb industrial infrastructure right across America. That's a top secret project that no one really no one knew about. It's incredible. So he was very useful. So these are some of the people that I talk about in the book that I interviewed, that I'm talking about live eyewitnesses. I talked to this man literally about an hour and a half ago. This is Howard Kikita. He's 90, he lives in Los Angeles now. He was one of about 3,000 Japanese Americans. So there's about 120,000 Japanese had emigrated to America by the start of the Second World War. And there's about 3,000 of them just happened, unfortunately, for them to either be on holiday, on business trips or whatever, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. So they ended up being marooned in Japan for the rest of the war. And then his luck got worse because his grandparents lived in Hiroshima. But he survived. So he's telling me the story of luckily for them, his grandparents' house was about 1.5 miles to 2 miles outside the blast zone. So it's what he experienced, seeing these thousands and thousands of bedraggled survivors staggering up out of the city. So that he was very, very insightful about that. But then equally, this lady here, I start the book with her story. She's called Michiko Kodama, and she's 90 as well now. She won the Nobel Peace Prize last November. She is the Secretary General of their Atomic Survivors Association, the Nihon, I always pronounce it wrong, the Nihon Hidanko. When she took over, there was probably about 150,000 by then. It was in the early 90s. And she said to me when I interviewed her 2 years ago, this picture here, she said there's about 5,500, 6,000 left now. A lot of them passed away from old age, but a great deal, many more of them have passed away because of their underlying illnesses. But I won't give you any spoiler alerts, but her story is, again, from a child's perspective, they were very lucky, her family, in terms of they lived probably about 200 yards away from what would have been ground zero. But because the city, as lots of Japanese cities were creating fire breaks because of the B-29 fire raids across Japan, they didn't really have very good functioning fire services. So the local authorities were saying, right, we're pulling down houses to create fire breaks to try and buy us some time. Her family was very well off, and they had a big house right in the center of town, got pulled down, so they ended up moving 2 miles outside of the blast zone. That's what saved them. So my book starts with her being dropped off. First day at school is the day they dropped the bomb in her new school. So I talk about that and what she experienced. And then this is, I think, really important. It's probably one of the key characters in the whole book. This shows what, and I'm not blowing my own trumpet, it's just, it is what it is. Good research does. You keep digging, because I mean, I must have done, there's probably about 20 avenues I followed over a 2-3 year period of research. And a lot of them ended nowhere, because you just come up to roadblocks. But I had an idea, I had this light bulb popped in my head thinking, well, who was in charge of Hiroshima? There must have been someone in charge that wasn't military, because it was a military town by then. And I found out it was this guy. His name's Senkichi Iwaya, and here he is sitting with his family. He's from Tokyo. The whole family are from Tokyo. But he died instantly. His mayor's residence was 400 or 500 meters. You'll see a photo at the end of the presentation. So obviously obliterated straight away. But it's almost like his past has been obliterated as well. I interviewed the director of the museum in Hiroshima, and he didn't know his name. I said, have you heard of this guy, Senkichi Iwaya? He said, no, I don't know him. I'd imagine it's because all the records in the city were destroyed as well. You know, everything was destroyed. But luckily for me, he had 7 children. 3 of them survived the war. And his eldest daughter here, Motoko, she's passed away now. But in the 1960s, she decided, you know, I want to remember my father. So she wrote his memoir, his kind of career memoir. There's 1 copy, and she wrote it and put it in the National Library in 1965. It was last checked out in 1969 until I found it. And then I got it translated. And I was saying to one of the guests here, for my interviews with Japanese, I use translators. And for translating any documents, I use translators. If it's a history book and you're reading it, it has to be 100% accurate. And I don't speak Japanese. I can't read Japanese. So I need to get it completely right. Especially all the interviews that I did with the Japanese, we sent the interview transcribed back to them to say, is there anything you don't agree with, you've forgotten you've said, or you want to add to, and then it gets signed off. But anyway, his story is basically, he was a gifted administrator from about 1926 onwards, and he ran police forces across Japan. And what his career memoir shows is he was a Christian, only 5% of the country were Christian, and his main mentor in life was a pacifist. It's not to say he wasn't a patriot, not to say that he didn't agree with what his country was up to in the Pacific, which is what we know was, you know, verged on genocide. But it's interesting in terms of it lifts the lid on what it was like for someone to work in a country that's democratic, and then, as I said at the beginning, falls into authoritarianism. How do you survive? What do you have to go along with to stay in your job, which is what he did. So we'll talk about him a little bit later. So very quickly, just obviously to set the background, because there are a few slides to go. Hirohito, Emperor Hirohito becomes Emperor of Japan, 1926. He's in charge of a burgeoning country. The West are heavily involved in building up Japan. From about 1854, once the Americans had opened it up at the end of a barrel, the US Navy, that is, that's when the West basically rebuilt Japan's economy. So by the time of the 1930s, even though it's suffering in the Great Depression, it's got one of the strongest economies in the Pacific Basin, in the Far East, in East Asia. But crucially, with Japan, it's got about 73 million people on the home islands. The home islands make up about 1% of land mass across the world. But the problem for Japan, even back then, it probably is still the same today, Back then, they've got 73 million people living on 73 million people is 5% of the global population in the 1930s, living on 1% of land. And if anyone's been to Japan, you'll know what it's like. There's not much great vast plains of farming land. They have to import a lot of food. It's a very mountainous country, hasn't got a lot of mineral wealth, certainly hasn't got any oil. So if you're developing this powerful economic base that then powers one of the strongest armed forces in East Asia, what are you going to do? So the picture on the right is Japanese troops celebrating once they've gone through into Manchuria in the early 30s, and then by 1937, they've launched the war, the disastrous war against China. And it's not that well known that there's more troops throughout the Second World War, with all the fighting going on in the Pacific against the Allies in America. There's 1.5 million troops in China, just bogged down in a war that they knew they couldn't win. Because like the Nazis in the Soviet Union in the Second World War, the country's just vast, it's just too big. And you can conquer city after city, but you can't conquer all the land, especially if your enemy is then escaping into the hinterland. So that's where the Japanese army was. It hasn't captured all the oil fields it wanted to, it hasn't captured all the mineral wealth, and it hasn't subdued China, which is being supported by the Allies and especially America. So they then make the disastrous decision of, well, how are we going to keep our economy running, keep the military running? Whoops. We'll attack the Allies. We'll attack the American Pacific Fleet on December 7th, 1941. Insane. I mean, if there's anyone here who doesn't think it's insane, I think you're wrong. Every time I still look at this slide, and the first thing in my head is, what were they thinking? Their strategy was obviously, let's cripple the American fleet, surprise attack. If we cripple it, maybe destroy. The plan was obviously to destroy not just the fleet, but their carrier force, because it's air power that's going to dominate the coming war. Their plan was, and this is where I was talking about annotation. Sorry, you won't see all the annotation because the map is a little bit far away. But within the first 6-7 months of the war beginning, everything's going well for them. They're creating an empire that's thousands and thousands of nautical square miles. They've captured huge swathes of Thailand, Burma. They're going into Burma. The Philippines is gone. The Americans have retreated from there. They're going into New Guinea. They're almost launching air attacks by now on northern Australia. I think I would argue that's why that when you look at a lot of the first year of fighting the Japanese, if you look at a lot of propaganda that was going on with the Allies and the Americans, magazines that the troops were reading, they're always saying this super soldier that we're up against, this amazing Japanese soldier who can march for miles, only survives on a handful of rice, learns how, knows jungle combat amazingly well. One could argue that they had to come up with some reasoning for us being completely devastated in the Pacific region and being pushed back the way we were, and all these, the loss of Hong Kong, how do you explain it? But, as you can see, the Japanese, the plan they thought was, if we have this outer defensive perimeter, where we're thousands of kilometers away, sea kilometers away from any American task force, they just did not believe the Americans would have the willpower and be ready to accept the huge losses that would be involved in doing an island-hopping campaign with the US Marines and then the US Army coming up this way through the Philippines. Would the Americans want to do this? The Japanese thought they wouldn't. The Japanese never thought that they would ever come under any threat from soldiers landing on mainland Japan, but crucially, air attacks. And that's why the Japanese, you'll see in some later slides, would suffer terribly from the Americans' aerial bombing campaign, because they hadn't invested in fire equipment to a greater degree. In fact, they slashed the budgets, and crucially, they didn't build that many air raid shelters in their cities. So the Manhattan Project, how did it start? So I'm sure if you've watched the film, you know this scene on the left where Albert Einstein has fled Germany. He's gone to Britain for about a year. There's a very good documentary on Netflix which it dramatizes his year in Britain. I'd recommend you look for it. But this is why he's now in the United States. This is the famous Szilard letter that he's holding. And this is the culmination of months of lobbying by the younger generation of physicists and chemists that have fled Nazi Germany, but then have fled Nazi-occupied France, left Hungary, which has fallen under dictatorship as well, Italy, all these amazing teams of people in their, some as young as their mid-20s, but obviously a lot younger than the super rock star Albert Einstein. But they know his profile in the States, he's got the ability to be invited into the White House, into the seat of power where President Roosevelt is. The British had already warned Einstein that the Nazis are enriching uranium. They've got their own thing called the Uranium Club in Berlin. It was still very sketchy, but the British had already confirmed that enriched uranium could fission, and even 1 kilogram of enriched uranium could destroy a whole port. 3 kilograms could take out a whole city. These are the fears that this new generation that are also following the same path Einstein did, and they're going to the States to work for the American government, to work for universities like Princeton, like Yale. They convince Einstein, if we draft this letter, will you give it to the President of the United States, outlining this argument? And that's what he does. He would later regret it. You see that in the film. And there's an interesting anecdote that I'll tell you about at the end of the presentation. But the British did push, and I talk about it to a degree, but the British set up the Maud Committee, which was the military application of uranium detonation. So they were taking in these refugees from Europe, and we were almost like the landing zone for these guys. A lot of them did stay in our universities, like Birmingham, you were saying, in Manchester, making their way to London as well. We're at war with the Nazis by then, with Germany, sorry. And so they were now being listened to because Britain is at war. They're being told the Nazis could have this super bomb. The reports they write, the Maud report, is what really shook Einstein to say, we've got to do something. So he met with Roosevelt in the White House, as I capture in the book. He tells him about the letter. It's been drafted for him. He just signs it. He endorses it. And this is what shakes Roosevelt to say, okay, we've got to do something. Remember, they're not at war yet with Japan or anyone else. There's only so much he can do. He's already, he will bring in Lend-Lease, but for now, he puts this guy in charge. This is Vannevar Bush. He's a key player, not just in the Manhattan Project, but pretty much in every single military development going for the USA during the Second World War. And he was one of the top industrialists in the US. He'd realized the mistakes America had made in the Great War. So it was his job to join the military and America's industrial strength and mass mobilize it, because the Americans hadn't done that in the Great War. So when the American Expeditionary Force came over to fight in France, Britain and France had to lend them most of their materials to fight with. They just didn't have it. Oh, someone's trying to ring me. Don't need to have that. Sorry about that, guys. So he was in charge, and it was his job. Roosevelt gave him the job to say, you need to bring together both arms. You need to bring our military forces together and all heavy industry, all the big industrial companies. Doesn't matter whether they're going to build tanks, trucks, ships like the Liberty ship, or what we'll see later on, the B-29. You need to bring them together. But he also had on his desk the Manhattan Project. And at the beginning, this is the key thing. They weren't at war. There's only so much they can do. He was only allowed to have $600,000 for the Manhattan Project right at the beginning. And it was 12 men, elderly men, industrialists, meeting in a dusty room once a month. That was the Manhattan Project at its birth. But as soon as they're at war and Pearl Harbor's happened, that's when, as everything else did, it goes into overdrive. And this is where I find Groves a really, really interesting figure. And that's one of the things I would say Oppenheimer, the movie, falls down on. Matt Damon kind of captures his character as in he's a bulldog chewing a wasp. But you barely see Groves in the movie. When you think, in my opinion, and there's a lot of people think the same thing, this man should have statues around America for what he did, not just on the Manhattan Project, but everything else in between. He only got the Manhattan job because he was delivering huge projects like this before the war. So he built the biggest building in the world at the time, the Pentagon, and he built it on time and under budget, and he had a workforce of 10,000. Before that, he was in charge of rebuilding America's infrastructure, military infrastructure across the United States, including Hawaii. And we're talking about docks, ports, training bases, barracks, airstrips, everything. It was his job to re-energize after the Great Depression what America was capable of in training, arming, and sending its troops off to war. And he did such a good job that he was the man that they wanted for the Manhattan Project. So once they're at war, by the middle to late 1942, he's offered the job. At the time, so his grandson gave me this photo. He's not looking too happy. He's obviously looking very thin. But he's a colonel. So I put this in the presentation because here you can see he's a colonel of US Army engineers. That's what he was when he was building things like this. But he'd said at the time when he was offered the Manhattan job, well, I want a promotion. I need a promotion because I'm going to be dealing with some of the world's best physicists, chemists, engineers, everything else. I've only got a high school diploma in physics. How are they going to take me seriously? So that's where he was instantly promoted. It was the sugar on the pill, I suppose. He was, because he wanted frontline combat. And they said, you're unfit, you're 42, it's not going to happen. So they promoted him instantly to brigadier general. And then he would end the war being a 2-star general. But the power that he wielded, because it's a top secret, one of the biggest top secret projects in America at the time, was far, far bigger than a 2-star general. He had the power of almost a joint chiefs of staff of what he wanted to get for the project. And that would come back to bite him, as I'll talk about at the end. But here we are. And this is, again, he did for the Manhattan Project what he'd done already. This wasn't anything new to him. So he wanted the guy to run it that he wanted, that he rated, which was J. Robert Oppenheimer, which you see in the film. There was a lot of question marks from the FBI and US military about his past credentials, left-wing, leaning, the groups he'd hung out with. But I think, and what his grandson told me, Groves' grandson told me, was he saw himself in Oppenheimer. He saw that Oppenheimer was an unheralded genius and very Sheldon Cooper. But he was a genius. Ironically, he would be one of the top scientists at Los Alamos that didn't have a Nobel Prize. Most of the guys that he would manage and supervise and direct and everything else that a director of the laboratory would do, they all had. He didn't. But he knew he could deliver it because, again, both men signed up for this project knowing the race they were under. They both passionately believed the Manhattan Project was 18 months behind the Germans. They were fully expecting the Germans would drop the bomb first. And that led to how quickly the Manhattan Project would take shape. So all the main industrialists like DuPont, they were building the world's first nuclear reactor in Washington State. In Hanford in Tennessee, enriched uranium. He's now running a project that employs roughly about 110, 120,000 people right across the States, whether they're working in engineering plants, factories, enrichment plants, etc., etc. And what he passionately believed in, which is maybe why Oppenheimer fell down on that, was compartmentalization. No one knew what the other person was doing. This was seen in Los Alamos, which you don't really see in the movie. By the time they'd finished, Los Alamos was a city in the desert, in New Mexico desert, had about 10,000 people. Obviously, it's a top secret Camp X. Not many people know about it. But within the camp, some of the people I was interviewing, apart from the real key team, the cream of the team, you're talking about 200 people that are working on the weapon, on the gadget. Everybody else is working on various elements outside of that circle of trust. So all of them knew they were working on something obviously top secret, special. It's obviously going to be a weapon, but they had no idea it was a nuclear weapon. It was only the top people in the team knew this. And that's thanks to the security he set up. So get back to Hersey. And I just put this story because it's just such a funny story. And we all need a laugh when you talk about the atomic bomb. Do you recognize this man? Yeah, this is Kennedy. Who was to know that an ex-girlfriend of JFK would be his wife? And so they became friends. Both men became friends. And in 1944, they both lived in Manhattan. And in 1944, his wife, his joined the men together in a cocktail bar in Manhattan for a specific reason. It was to rebuild his reputation. So basically, the man Hersey met in that bar was a wreck physically. So the injuries that we knew he had when he was president, he got because he'd been in a botched operation as a torpedo, PT torpedo boat commander in the Pacific. They got the flotilla he was with had got their coordinates wrong on a navigation exercise, obviously on the front line, ran into a flotilla of Japanese ships. His boat had been rammed by a Japanese destroyer and sunk. 18 men on the ship, 3 died in the collision. The rest survived, somehow managed to scramble their way to safety on an atoll, about a 1.5 mile swim. Many were severely wounded. He was severely wounded. So the man he meets is crushed mentally, and his morale is crushed too, because what he's saying to Hersey is, well, my career's over before it started. I'm not a military, I wanted to be a military war hero. That was the whole point of this. Because my dad, Senator Joe Kennedy, wants me to run for office back home in Boston. I've got no chance. No one knows me. I haven't done anything. But the more he talked over drinks with Hersey, he didn't realize that Hersey had already been given the Pulitzer Prize for a novel. So when he was in Sicily, the memories and interviews he took from there, he then wrote a kind of catch-22, before catch-22 was ever written, called A Bell for Adano, and it came out in late 43. And then Hollywood turned it into a movie, which you can find on YouTube. And he won the Pulitzer Prize. So this man knows how to tell a tale. So as he sat with JFK, he realizes, well, there is a story here. The reason I'm telling you this is to point out that this man here, even though he would write the story of Hiroshima, which is very noble, ultimately he's a jobbing journalist. He lives from job to job to job. He's a freelance writer. He needs jobs. So he says to JFK, well, look, I'll write this story up for you. And he sells it to Reader's Digest, at the time with the biggest magazine in circulation in the States. Does make him into a war hero. And crucially, his father, Senator Joe Kennedy, buys 100,000 copies of that issue and then floods the congressional district in Boston when he runs his son for Congress. And obviously he wins and he launches his son's career. That's how the two men would know each other. But that's the power, I'm telling you all this, that's the power of words from this man. That's how effective he was. So a character that's in the book, but he's not on the front cover. I'll be quick, so we've got quite a few slides, and I don't want to drag this on. But this is Hap Arnold. So he's the father of basically the American Air Force we see today. At the time, in the Second World War, it was the US Army Air Corps, which would then become the US Army Air Force by the end of the war. But he had learnt to fly with the Wright brothers. This is how he looks at the end of the war. He never saw any action in his whole career. When all the big fighting was going on towards the end of the war in the Pacific, and when you'll see it in a little while, you've got the B-29 bombing Japan, the Enola Gay, etc. He's in charge of all this. But like some mafia boss, he's in his palatial mansion in Florida, guiding it all, because he's had lots of health scares. He had 4 heart attacks in the Second World War. Almost killed him, obviously. But he was a visionary. There's no escaping that, because he was one of the guys that was beating the drum. I'm sure there's some British person that was doing the same thing in the 1930s. He watched what the Germans had done in the Spanish Civil War with their air power. He watched what the Italians did in Abyssinia. And then he watched what the Luftwaffe was doing in the first year of the war against Poland and Holland and France. And he was banging the drum saying, the bomber will always get through. And he knew that eventually we're going to need a long-range bomber if we ever have to fight in Europe again. But we are definitely going to need a long-range bomber if we probably will be at war with Japan. They could see the strategy coming down the track. From as far back as about 1932, military planners were planning what they would do, wargaming, what they would do with Japan. And one of his special tasks was building this plane. He is the father of, I would argue, the most deadly weapon, the most influential weapon, I should say, in terms of social, economic, and military perspectives. Social economic, because to create the B-29 cost more money than the Manhattan Project. It's about $3.8 billion. It cost to build 4,500 B-29s by the end of the war, which is roughly 27, 28 billion in today's money. But this was his vision made real. He'd said, we need a plane that can fly those thousands of miles across the Pacific, bomb Japan, and get home safely. And to do that, they had to almost go space age. And I say space age because, again, you look at the very famous iconic canopy of the B-29. That's what George Lucas used for the Millennium Falcon. It is the B-29 cockpit. But this plane is amazing, which I go into great detail on because I just find it fascinating. Social economic benefits were they deliberately built the manufacturing base for the B-29 that employed hundreds of thousands of people in the Midwest of America. Obviously, the reason there is security, because they just thought we're in the middle of the country, we're not going to have any kind of sabotage, they'll never be able to find us or get there. But primarily, it's to rebuild the shattered economies of the Midwest that had just crumbled to dust in the Great Depression. And that's exactly what it did, still does today. But this plane was incredible. It could fly almost 40,000 feet altitude because it had the world's first pressurized air cabin. Had 4 amazing engines, fuel-injected engines, that gave it twice the range of the B-17. So it had a range of about 3,500 kilometers, and it had twice the payload. And that would be to deadly effect against Japan. That was the whole point of building it. So if you've got the most amazing plane in your arsenal, you've got to have the best pilot. And this is where Paul Tibbets comes in. This is a promotional shot of him after the war, but he's dressed in his US Army Air Force attire from the European campaign. Because again, this he was the top pilot. That's why he was chosen to test fly the B-29, because his war record in Europe was second to none. He'd come across in the very first wave of B-17s across the Atlantic to set up the 8th Air Force. Then if you've seen the program on Sky, Masters of the Sky, I think it's called, he led the very first air raids into occupied France, and then he led the first 100 bomber raid against Germany. Had to redevelop tactics because he saw a lot of his planes go down, a lot of his crews were killed. I argue in the book that by the time he came home after 2 years of arduous combat, relentless, he must have had PTSD. He must have had. But saying that, they still said, you're going to be the test pilot for B-29. And he flew with Major Ferriby, his bomb aimer, and Major Van Kirk, his navigator. They were called the Three Musketeers. All 3 men flew with each other right from the beginning of the war in a B-17. Those 3 men would fly the Enola Gay because they all trusted each other. They were all brilliant at their jobs. So he's test flown the B-29 for about 18 months, and he's got it combat ready because it went through a lot of teething problems. Whoops. Is it working? There we go. So it seemed natural that once the Manhattan Project is almost over the line in terms of they can see daylight in that they're going to deliver the bomb in the next 5 to 6 months, they need the cruise trains to drop this thing. It's a top secret project. So just like Oppenheimer and everyone else, Tibbets has to go through his own security checks. He's offered the job. He wants to take it. Who wouldn't? And then this is where, again, he's like Groves. He's given unlimited power. He's still a colonel, but he's given power that very few military leaders in the US Armed Forces had. He had a code name, Silver Plate, and all he had to do to get the best crews across any theater where American airplanes were flying, best bomb aimers, best navigators, he had to train 19 crews. And then from those 19 crews, he would select 3 that would go, eventually would be chosen to be bombing with the atomic bomb. They sequestered themselves in the Utah desert at a place called Wendover. Again, safe from prying eyes. And he just trained them relentlessly. That's what he was good at. He was a great man manager, ruthless, brilliant as well. It was like, I won't ask anyone to do what I can't do. And he just led from the front. But the level of security they had around this airbase was equivalent to Los Alamos, because a lot of the Los Alamos scientists would come back and forwards to Wendover to talk about the tactics that they would need when they're dropping the atomic bomb. But to then Tibbets was brought right into the circle of trust. He knew months before the other crews did what they were going to be dropping. So he was informed, and he gave very valuable avionics advice about how they should design the bomb. But it was called the 509th. And this is where it would end up. So as you saw from the map at the beginning, this is what this is the Japanese military's leadership's worst nightmare come real. These are the Marianas Islands. They're about 1,500 miles southeast of mainland Japan, 700 miles southeast of Okinawa, which would be the big last battle before they were going to attack the mainland. But they wanted these bases because, as you can see, they were wide enough. There was about 7 or 8 islands. The Americans had lost about 5,000 or 6,000 US Marines to take these islands. It had been as bloody as any other campaign. But as you can see, what they were doing, the American naval engineers, the Seabees, built 3 of the world's biggest airports on these coral islands, which they just hammered until they could make 4,000-meter long runways. And this is where Hap Arnold, that gentleman who invented the Air Force, had his Air Force. So these planes you can see parked here, he had about 400 B-29s. They were just doing conventional bombing raids with high explosives over mainland Japan by the end of 1944. Wasn't really working that well because they're flying from high altitude, and because the jet stream flows across Japan, it makes navigation and steering almost impossible. Bombs were constantly missing their target. There was talk in Washington of, should we just give up on this B-29 because it clearly is not doing what it was supposed to do. We've spent billions on it. But this is where Hap Arnold, from his base in Florida, got ruthless. He fired the guy who was in charge, Henry Hansel, his name was. He was had, I suppose, more moral fiber. He was very much of the old school of, I'm going to do high precision bombing. I'm not going to bomb civilian populations. I'm not going to do indiscriminate bombing. It's wrong. So he was fired, and this guy was brought in, General Curtis LeMay. As you can see, quite a tough character. That is very, very him. And a lot of you may know, he was in charge of the Air Force in in the early 60s during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he was the one giving JFK the advice that, he could turn Cuba into a car park. But crucially, at this point, I call the chapter in the book Crossing the Rubicon. He accepted the failure of high-altitude explosive bombing and knew that this new weapon that had been invented at Harvard University, you won't find any plaque at Harvard saying they invented napalm, but they did. This was the new weapon that the Americans were now putting into play in the fighting in the Pacific. So whether it's canisters being dropped by fighter bombers like P-51 Mustangs on pillboxes, defensive entrenchments on Japanese-held islands, or like this, where it's 36 cluster bombs in one giant bomb, and then you drop thousands of those big bombs on Japanese cities. And that's what he said, that's the way to go. So instead of high altitude, he decided on March the 9th and 10th, it's called the Great Tokyo Fire Raid. He'd send in 309 B-29s. I think in the end, 289 made the trip. But they saturated Tokyo in napalm, killed approximately 100,000 civilians, mainly men, women, and children, elderly men and women and children. But I think burnt to the ground 16 square miles of Tokyo. And then about 3 weeks later, he sent another wave in and they killed 83,000 people. And I think it took about 9 square kilometers of Tokyo. But it worked. And, they're at war. They have to beat the enemy somehow. They have to bring them to their knees. So this map, you can see from where you're sitting, what I'm trying to show you is how many cities he would now bomb. So you can just see bottom there. It just shows you how easy it was from the Marianas Islands. The B-29s had full reign over Japan. So over the next few months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they would bomb multiple times 66 cities across Japan. And you've got to remember that earlier photo right at the beginning I showed you, a lot of the housing, the majority of housing in Japan was traditional. So it's made of paper and wood. So it's perfect. And what I talk about in the book is planners, strategists in America, working with scientists, they all knew that. From about 1932, they tried to develop how do we attack the enemy and make them surrender as quickly as possible. And the incendiary raids were working. They dehoused 8.5 million people, probably killed 900,000 to 1 million people by the time Hiroshima was about to happen. So this is where we get back to Senkichi. So he'd actually retired in 1943, because he'd had a checkered career. He was a successful administrator, but what I talk about in the book is that he worked for the Ministry of Home Affairs. His loyalty is to the government, the civilian running government. And he runs police forces, but he then wants to apply the law as it's written down in the Constitution. But the trouble is, he wants to apply the law to everyone, civilian and military. And so he has a lot of run-ins from about late 1930s all the way through to 42, where his policemen are, if anyone steps out of line, naturally they get arrested. But he makes a lot of enemies in the military leadership because they think it's embarrassing because they're running the country, which they are. So in the end, I think the stress causes ill health, he retires, but he's then dragged out of retirement in 43 because of that picture I was telling you about. The Americans are getting closer. The leadership know there's an invasion coming. Our most important military hub in southern Japan is Hiroshima. The Japanese fleet that attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor, they'd left from Hiroshima. That 1.5 million Japanese troops in China, they'd all left in ships from Hiroshima. It's got a massive arsenal just outside of the city. It's a legitimate military target. They need a man to run it successfully. So he's not asked, he's told, you're taking a train down to Tokyo and you're going to run the city. And again, he runs into problems because he's questioning the military to say, why are young children being taken out of school and forced to work in armament factories when we know that they're too young to do that? Why have you cut the city's rations, the rice ration, in half again? And he's told, well, it's because we're moving more and more troops down to the south and we're preparing for the invasion. So all this kind of infighting was going on that he had to navigate. So the argument, we're nearly done, folks, but the argument for dropping on Hiroshima, again, a lot of you guys will know this, but we get to Okinawa, and this is the kind of fighting the US Marines are now encountering. If you look at the casualty rates for the Americans, they lose more men, they have higher casualties in the last 6 months of the first 6 months of 1945, they have more casualties than the 3 years combined of fighting. And it's the same on the Japanese side, because as they're getting closer with the island hopping, the Japanese are obviously putting up a more sacrificial defense, fighting to the last man. So on Okinawa, the Americans take casualties of over 60,000. I think from that 14,000 dead, they lose 27 ships sunk, another 35 damaged, 5,000 Navy personnel dead as well, because they're facing this kind of thing. This is where they encounter mass kamikaze attacks for the first time. Over 1,500 kamikaze pilots die just defending Okinawa. And crucially, the garrison on Okinawa, the Japanese garrison of over 120,000, which includes militia, they almost fight to the last man. And then you've got the shocking scene of Okinawan civilians jumping off the cliffs, committing suicide because they believe their government propaganda that they don't want to be captured by the enemy. So if you've spent all that blood and guts taking this island that's only 60 miles long and 5 miles wide, you can imagine what American strategists are now thinking. And now we've got Truman in charge. He's just been given the job in April. He'd been kept in the dark by Roosevelt because Roosevelt's one of those guys where he just wanted a small coterie of his closest advisors. He kept his vice president out of the loop. So I have a huge admiration for Truman in terms of he has to catch up with so much so quickly. On his first day in office, he's told he's going to be going to Potsdam eventually. He'll be going to Germany to meet with Stalin and Churchill, two men he completely reveres, he's never met. He's told about the Manhattan Project. He learns about the actual casualty lists of what they're facing in the Pacific, several thousand killed every week, hundreds of thousands killed every month, civilians in the Philippines. To capture Manila, 100,000 civilians die because the Japanese just put up suicidal defense. So you can understand why he's so pleased while he's at Potsdam in July. The Trinity test, as you see in the movie, is successful. The uranium bomb's done. They know the uranium bomb will work. That's the one that is set off by a gun implosion within the device. They wanted to test whether the plutonium bomb worked. So that's what the Trinity test is about, because they've got enriched plutonium is almost online from the enrichment facility in Washington State. And Groves has already said to Truman and his administration, by October, I'll be able to give you 100 plutonium bombs. That's how many we'll have. So that's why the test is so important, and it works. So he knows he's got that up his sleeve while he's at Potsdam. He tells Stalin, but Stalin already knew because of a British spy, Klaus Fuchs, that had been at Los Alamos since 1943. So Berier's quickly doing his own thing in Siberia, but they're still quite a few years behind. So when you're faced with this decision, there is no good decision, is there? You either agree to launch Operation Olympic, which is the invasion of Kyushu, the South Island of mainland Japan, which military strategists are saying, by Christmas, we could have easily be taking at least 500,000 casualties. The whole operation might cost 1 million casualties. Civilian deaths could be as high as 4 million on mainland Japan, judging by what's happened at Okinawa. Or does he think, okay, I will listen to General Groves and the Joint Chiefs, we have to use this weapon. So like I said, there is no good decision to be made. It's what will drive the Japanese to surrender. They've already issued the Potsdam Declaration of Unconditional Surrender. The Japanese don't even reply to the first ultimatum because Hiroshima hasn't happened. So on August 5th, the news comes through, special mission number 13 is a go. The Enola Gay there it is, on the tarmac, ready to roll. There's the team. Normally you have 9 people in an air crew of a B-29. The Enola Gay has 11 because the Manhattan Project has to have 2 weaponeers aboard with Tibbets and his crew because they've made the wise decision that they won't allow the aircraft to take off from Tinian with the bomb armed because they realize if anything goes wrong, it will take the island's gone. And as Tibbets would testify later, around the seas of Tinian at the end of the runway are the wrecks of crashed B-29s that had suffered the same fate. It's just, this happens. They can't afford an accident. So it's agreed that the plane will fly for the first hour at 5,000 feet, having taken off, and that gives stable weather conditions for Captain Deke Parsons from the US Navy, who's part of the Manhattan Project, to go through the crawl space into the bomb bay and arm the bomb. And then they're good to go. What I talk about in the book was the crew literally had a few hours briefing. They only knew a few hours before they took off that they were carrying an atomic bomb. What they didn't know was that the surgeon, the island surgeon on the base, secretly gave Tibbets a packet of cyanide pills and said, if the plane goes down and if you're over mainland Japan or if you're going to crash into the Sea of Japan and some of the crew all survive, you cannot be taken alive. Here's the cyanide pills. This is Little Boy. It's by no means Little Boy. It's actually, when you look at it, it's actually quite accurate in its dimensions on the screen. It's about 12 feet long and 6 feet in circumference. And crucially, again, this is part of the research. I always thought the whole thing blew up, as in it's got 3 kilograms of enriched uranium in the bomb. So I thought the whole thing had gone off when you look at what happened to Hiroshima. Only 1.7% of the enriched uranium fissioned. So 1.7% of enriched uranium did all that to Hiroshima. Imagine if the whole thing had gone off. If you've been to Hiroshima, you know what it looks like. It would have taken out the mountain range that surrounded it too. It's incredible. But again, a funny story. Once they actually assembled the bomb, they realized it was too big for the bomb bay. And so this is where the RAF came into its own. One of our leading RAF guys said, I think something going on here. Got a buzz. One of our leading guys said, well, you can borrow one of our Lancasters because we're dropping tall boys, so the dimensions of our bomb bay are completely fine. A couple of politicians in Washington said, that's a good idea. And then obviously the leadership on Tinian found out and said, well, an American plane is dropping an American bomb. And so they spent the next 24 hours frantically re-welding the bomb bay to get Little Boy in. Oh, sorry. But I put this in, this is an artist friend of mine too, so I just think it's fascinating when you think about, Tibbets said to his grandson it was the easiest flight he ever flew, easiest mission he ever had. 6 hours there, 6 hours back, no enemy in sight, they're flying at 35,000 feet, Japanese interceptors wouldn't be able to get up there anyway, clear blue sky, the three planes that had gone over, the three weather planes that had gone an hour ahead of him over Kokura, Nagasaki, and Hiroshima were all reporting back which one's the best bet. And unfortunately for Hiroshima, that was it. You look at the bomb, the blast takes out everything in the first half-mile radius. 9 out of 10 people instantly evaporated. So you're talking about 40,000 people. Within 2 days, another 40,000 are dead too from their injuries and the effects of radiation poisoning. I'm getting a buzz here, but I don't know why this is happening. But anyway, I'll carry on. Surface temperature at ground zero is the same temperature as the sun, several thousand degrees. 24 out of 26 hospitals destroyed. 90% of doctors, 93% of nurses dead, and the rest will be dead within a few days. Even though the Imperial Army get people in within about 3 days, all utilities have been destroyed. All fire teams are dead. There's nothing they can do anyway. So you've got the survivors, and this is what I talk about from the witnesses that I interviewed. Some tried to jump into the rivers because they thought, you know, the heat wave that's hitting them and the fireball that hits them too, which takes out even more people. They jump into the rivers. They're at boiling point. They die instantly. So the ones that are still alive, they stagger. That's a very famous photo. There was one guy with one camera who managed to take photos just after the strike. And there's only 5 photos like this in the Hiroshima Memorial Museum. They gave me permission to use this one. And there aren't any more because he then gave up taking photos because it was so upsetting for him. But as you can see, again, you know the kind of photos you see, melted watches, people's they've evaporated, their shadows are on the steps. It's dystopian. But as we saw from the beginning, this is how the world were celebrating. And you can imagine, you know, you can condone the fact that they're celebrating in terms of they want to win the war. As yet, no one knows what we all know today about the dangers of a nuclear holocaust because they hadn't got that yet. They're seeing this as a conventional bomb of TNT. They have no idea about radiation poisoning. They think this is the wonder weapon that's going to work. So Truman, obviously, he's ecstatic it's worked. He's an ex-artillery man from the Great War. He knows the power of TNT. He's ecstatic it's worked. So he gives this broadcast to the Japanese. Sorry. We shall destroy their lives, their factories, and their civilizations. Wherefore, being so, we shall completely destroy the parents' power and not more. It was to destroy the life of these people from their protection. That the also from 2007 it's nearly finished. Those firmly rejected that estimate. If they do not know that there was a global world and the record which has never been seen on this earth. Did you hear that? Yeah. Good. Sorry about that. I didn't realize it'd be that loud. Reign of Ruin is a key phrase from the end of the Second World War. There's been books with that title. That's what he promised. That's what they were already doing, as you saw from the incendiary rays. And those 3 days in between Hiroshima and Nagasaki, B-29 incendiary raids, increased. So they were just the whole point was to keep the pressure on the Japanese leadership to surrender. The main point I was going to say, the way I see it is, they're looking at Germany. In the last year of war with Germany, when they could have surrendered and they didn't, they were going to fight to the end. What did we have to do? We had to overrun Germany completely from west and the east. Another 6 million casualties. So the American strategists are looking at thinking, well, look what it's cost us to do to Germany. The Japanese are going to do the same thing. So we should drop another bomb, and that's what they do. So obviously Nagasaki's attacked 3 days later. 70,000 people ultimately die in Nagasaki. And that's when the Japanese finally come to the table. The document's signed on the 2nd of September. By this time, the surrender's on the 15th of August, which is what we know VJ Day. But it's on the 2nd of September when the US Pacific Fleet is now anchored in Tokyo Bay Harbor. And General MacArthur's there giving his speech. The Japanese delegation come aboard the USS Missouri to sign the document, which Truman 2 days later is then showing off to the world's press. The war is over. Everything is done. But this is, again, this is just good. It's just really interesting research. I didn't know this happened until I found this in the CBS archives in Los Angeles. So this explains the kind of mindset, I suppose, good and bad, of what was going on in the States. They've dropped the bombs, Japan's defeated. October 27th every year in America is Navy Day. Senior service, like ours is a senior service. They have big parades all across America. They changed the title to Tribute to Victory just for that year because they just won the war. And what they decided to do was they would obviously have their parades and floats and veterans marching in every city and town across America. But to hold it all together in a kind of live aid moment, they had a live radio broadcast from the Los Angeles Coliseum, which holds about 100,000 people. And it was an all-dayer. They had the cream of Hollywood. Edward G. Robinson was the compere. And they had, Hollywood stars in there. They had Hollywood set builders there too, and hundreds of actors. And what they did was they recreated every battle American forces had fought in the Second World War to, obviously, the audience. But it's being relayed right across the nation live. And like I said, it was called Tribute to Victory. And at the end, as night's falling, you can probably guess where I'm going with this, they encircled the stadium in a kind of Nuremberg fashion with 80 powerful searchlights. And they're all pointing up at one point. And a lone B-29 bomber came over the stadium, about 300 feet. And Edward G. Robinson is describing what's going on. And then it drops a theatrical little boy on the stage from a parachute. And a massive mushroom cloud goes up, pyrotechnics, everything. Half the crowd go crazy. And I would argue they must have been returning veterans. And who wouldn't? Because you're alive. But in the crowd, there's a lot of civilians go silent. There's women weeping. And then G. Robinson gives quite a somber, kind of almost reflective speech, considering he's been very jingoistic the whole way through the day. He then, he maybe with foresight, he said, let's hope this kind of weapon's never used again. But in general, it's quite a kind of 50-50, because I've listened to the broadcast, and it's at one point it sounds like Gladiator. There's a crowd go crazy when this atomic bomb's been dropped. But that's the good news story. In Japan, General MacArthur's the new emperor of occupied Japan. He would be for the next 5-6 years. He's kept Hirohito in power just to keep the Japanese happy. But I would argue he does a great job because he has to demilitarize Japan. He has to repatriate well over 2 million Japanese soldiers back into Japan. He has to rebuild the country's economy, has to rebuild Japan, and then has to reconstitute a democratic government. And he does this successfully. Obviously, they plow in billions of dollars, but it's in their interest. This is the Japan we see today. That's all good news. But the bad news story, which is what I'm talking about in my book and the story arc, is why in Hiroshima and Nagasaki are children and survivors, elderly, anyone really a survivor, why are they dying in their thousands, week on week, month on month, all the way through the end of 1945 into 1946? And any medical teams, Japanese or otherwise, that go to these cities to do analysis, they're barred in general, and those that do get in and do reports, MacArthur's censors either close the newspapers that want to publish it, or they're told to leave the country if they're Western reporters. 2 Western reporters get into Hiroshima. One's Australian, one's American. And this is what I was talking about with Oppenheimer, where I think he's got a stain on his character, in terms of they come back and say, there is something going on. It must be something to do with radiation from the bombs. That's what's killing these people. They're dying of thyroid cancers, all types of cancers. But this is when the government's trying to portray nuclear energy as a good thing. It's going to be the source of energy for the economy going forward. It's going to be a source of America building an impregnable armed forces with these atomic bombs. No one's ever going to touch it again. So they can't really have this story. So this is where General Groves goes in front of a congressional committee and he actually says, well, my scientists and medical teams in the Manhattan Project have told me dying of radiation poisoning is a pleasant way to die. Then one of the scientists in the Manhattan team that worked with Oppenheimer breaks ranks and he says, well, we were always worried about gamma radiation poisoning. And that's what's going on in the cities. And one of our own team died of gamma radiation poisoning in an experiment that failed at Los Alamos. And again, that did happen. But Oppenheimer agrees to go with the government press junket and goes in front of the world's press to say, basically condemning him as a whistleblower. He's unhappy. He got pushed aside, didn't get the credit he was due. He's just trying to make trouble. Don't believe him. And he actually, again, he's on record as saying that. So this is where Hersey comes back. We're going to go a few more slides. This is where Hersey comes into the story. Again, jobbing journalist. He's back in New York. His war's over. But he's employed by the New Yorker, who's hoping to become a more serious magazine. It's kind of had enough of the fridge freezers and the Cadillacs and the dresses and everything else. It wants to have a heavy-hitting story to end the war. And so they commission him because he was actually born in China. He could speak Chinese before he spoke English. His parents were missionaries. But he's got a lot of contacts in the Far East, and that helps him. So he manages to smuggle himself into Japan, into Tokyo, gets on a train down to Hiroshima in May, June 1946. His contacts tell him to go and talk to this guy. He's a German Jesuit priest who's lived in Japan for 30-odd years. He had his church in Hiroshima and survived. But he was lucky. Maybe it was physiology, a miracle of physiology, even though he'd gone into ground zero afterwards and helped lots of survivors and set up a hospital in his church. He hadn't suffered from any kind of cancer. A lot of his other priests had died. But Hersey tells him the kind of story he wants to write. He trusts him, and so the Japanese trust him. Hersey spends 2 weeks in Hiroshima interviewing about 36 people, all ages, men, women, all different parts of Hiroshima. And he whittles it down to these 6. They're famously called the Hiroshima 6. One's a teacher, one's a doctor. These guys are either accountants, housewives, cook, but they each give compelling stories about how they survived. They're not trying to condemn America. They're just saying, well, this was just my experience of how I survived and what I witnessed, because no one knows that story yet. He manages to get it back to America. He gets back on a plane to Hawaii, then he gets a ship from Hawaii to San Francisco. He writes this in 3 days on the train back from San Francisco to New York, to the New Yorker. And it's held, he's basically ended his years in Yale University as an academic. And so all his papers are at Yale University. So I went there and I'm reading through all his papers. And this is the very first draft of Hiroshima. And what he didn't realize was he wrote 30,000 words. And it's very compelling because he believes it's in the first person. He wants to tell this story. 6 people is enough because it will really pack a punch. So that's the story. He gets back to the New Yorker, and they've been very devious. So to circumnavigate the censors, they've shut off one part of the office in Manhattan, and that's where a top secret team are going to put this new issue together that's just going to tell the story of Hiroshima. Normally, in a month issue of New Yorker, it would have 6 main articles, but such is the power of Hersey's words that the editor decides the whole issue is going to be just this article. And they're working behind closed doors. The rest of the New Yorker staff believe they're working on what the actual edition is going to be, just a normal edition, but it's not. They're going to do this. And then it's going to be printed in secret at a plant outside of New York. As you can see, again, they're clever. This is my copy of this issue, which I managed to buy from a collector. As you can see, if you're close enough, considering what you're going to read in those pages is atomic horror for the first time, this is a summer's day in Central Park. You know, sunbathing, horse riding, playing baseball, tennis, golf. You're not expecting to read, a story that you're going to lose sleep over, but that's exactly what they did. New Yorker would normally sell about 60,000 issues in total across the whole of the United States, predominantly, obviously, in Manhattan. Within its first week of issue in August, it sold 300,000 copies. And then by the end of the year, it sold over 1 million. And the power of the story is shown by the fact that within 3 weeks of this issue being launched, and you've got to remember, they didn't have the internet, 24-hour news, anything. Within 3 weeks of this coming out in Manhattan, BBC Radio are dramatizing it with actors, the 6 people. And that's how Britain found out about what had happened in Hiroshima. And crucially for Hersey, he'd taken himself away to hide on Martha's Vineyard because he knew what was coming. And you could argue, again, quite rightly, America's split down the middle, kind of. It's always split down the middle, isn't it? But it's split down the middle in terms of all those millions of returning veterans from Europe and the Pacific are dead against what he's writing, because they're saying, it saved all our lives. It ended the war. It saved military lives. It saved civilian lives. We believe what President Truman had said. Whereas the other half of the country, I'd argue, probably the ones that stayed in America, it's just shocking. And then it's even made more available by Penguin buying the book rights. And it's only 30,000 words. It's a tiny, tiny book. You can buy it on Amazon. Still in print today. To date, it's sold 3.8 million copies in the English language, and it's in 50 odd languages. But crucially, it sold really well. But as soon as we hit the 50s and both sides have the bomb, and we've got the era of MAD, where we've both got the hydrogen bomb, that's when I've studied the charts. That's where sales take off, and he's selling hundreds of thousands of copies. Because when you get to a hydrogen bomb, which the Americans had well before the Soviets. I mean, by 1949, they've got the hydrogen bomb. It's 1,000 times stronger, powerfuler than Little Boy. That's a genocidal weapon. So you've gone from a weapon that can destroy half a city to a weapon that can, if you have enough of them, you are going to destroy humanity. And that's where I would argue the Russians get it. Checkpoint Charlie, sorry. But that's where the Russians have it by the early 1950s. Well, by 1956, definitely under Khrushchev. Both sides can guarantee mutually assured destruction. And that's where you've just got this paranoia and legitimate fear of the world's going to end one day. We all survived the Cold War. I mean, I was in my teens during the 1980s and constantly watching documentaries about what the Red Army was going to do in Europe and how, the world will be over in minutes. That's where Hersey's story has really, really resonated into those generations. But to end, so we're coming to the end. What happened to the Hiroshima Men? Well, Groves, like I said, unlimited power. He really, really did have unlimited power, and it did come back to bite him. He made too many enemies from people that were well, well above his pay grade and his military grade, and one of whom was Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so this is before Dwight D. Eisenhower got the job to invade Europe. But he should have really got a lot higher than a brigadier or two-star general, I should say. He really should have got a lot higher, and he should have been in the army a lot longer. But Eisenhower finished his career and sidelined him to when he decided to take early retirement, which he did in his early 50s. And his grandson said he was a very bitter man. And that's why I've put this photo in. He spent the rest of his days touring all the offices and facilities of the Manhattan Project, giving speeches to the workers that had worked there, because like I said, there's over 130,000 of them, giving out medals, certificates, everything else. But, again, his role was kind of sidelined. And you see that in the movie. He's hardly in the movie. Whereas Hersey, I think, he's like Tibbets. He saw too much of the war, even before Hiroshima. And he retreated into academia. So he was a professor of English literature at Yale for the rest of his life. The only kind of public events he would do in America were to school children, where he would talk about the book, talk about what he'd seen. And then every 5 years, he would go to Japan to give speeches and meet up with the survivors, the Hiroshima 6, and they would do news junkets, that kind of thing. This is quite poignant, I think. So this is a picture of Tibbets, early 1960s. He's a military attaché to NATO in Paris. This is where he'd meet his second wife, who was French. And as you can see, he doesn't look particularly happy. He's a very serious man anyway. But this is from the early 90s. He hadn't actually gone up in a B-29 since he flew the Enola Gay. And so his grandson, Paul, 4, once he qualified to be a pilot and was in the Air Force, he secretly agreed, because there's several B-29s that are in completely great condition. You can go up today. It will cost you $5,000. I asked, and that's what I was told. I didn't want to, in the end, I didn't go. But so he took his grandfather as a surprise birthday present, his 80th birthday present, to Texas, and they went up in a plane, and it was the first time because he just hadn't been up in one. And he got the bug again, and he went up a couple of dozen times after that. But the key thing is, this is the poignancy, and is how I end the book, is he had a secret protocol put in his will And it stipulated that he didn't want a hero's funeral. He didn't want to be buried in Arlington. Obviously, he should have been, because he feared that it would be desecrated, and it would become some kind of symbol of protest or whatever. Because he'd obviously lived through Vietnam and all that kind of thing. So even Paul didn't realize what was going to happen, and he's his grandson. So they had a small funeral for him in Ohio, where he died. Then he was cremated, and then his French wife flew to London with the ashes. Got on a train down to Dover, got on the Dover ferry to France, and halfway across sprinkled his ashes on the English Channel. Because what he said in his will was, it was the happiest I ever was, because I was fighting, take this for what you want to take it as, a good war with my buddies. And that's why his ashes were just sprinkled on the English Channel. But again, I think I admire him more because of his message discipline. You can research him as much as I have. You will not find one instance of him saying he regretted, and he's been interviewed hundreds of times over his life, lots of interviews. He never regretted ever dropping the bomb. He said, I followed orders. There is no morality in war. Doesn't matter what you're using. I just happened to have dropped the world's first atomic bomb. I just followed orders. I would do it again. But I would argue, and I've said this to his grandson, and he thought the same thing, is what I talked about he dropped a bomb that was taking out half a city. It was still a huge bomb, but we're looking at it 80 years down the track when we've got these incredibly powerful, more nuclear weapons that, like I said, can take out humanity. Maybe he would think differently, I don't know. But again, Paul said, he had that opinion to the day he died. And so this is a final slide. This is Senkichi Iwaya's male residence, which no one knew about in the museum. And I'd been told that the Christian sect he belonged to in Tokyo came down in 1974 and erected this on the site of where his residence was. And that's how far away it was from Ground Zero. So there's the atomic dome. But I had to search through trees and bushes to find this, because again, there's no, like we would have a brown sign, wouldn't we, for some kind of historic monument. People were walking by, walking their dogs, cycling, everything. And there's just no one in the museum knew. I took that picture mainly to show them. And then I thought, well, I'll put it in the presentation because I think it's important. But that just goes to show how easy it is for people to be airbrushed out of history, not deliberately, just by chance, because his office just happened to be next to the world's biggest detonation. Everything was destroyed. The council buildings were destroyed. No one knew who he was. So on that happy note, that is the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and thank you for bearing with me.